Welcome to Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday, or maybe Monday. We've all lost track. We're in for such a treat this morning because we have somebody who just really is exemplary in every way of what our...
Well, not every way.
Well, all right. Well, I had a prepositional phrase coming that was qualifying that a tiny bit of what our program, our writing program, stands for. She works in multiple genres. She's written memoirs, which she's teaching personal narrative here, as many of you know, and she's also a novelist. So her latest book is a novel. She seems to alternate, you know, ambidextrous. And it's just getting wonderful press, deservedly, and everybody loves it. But the thing that really I have learned about Kim Barnes, watching her in action, is how incredibly dedicated she is to her students. It almost hurts. And I was standing in the parking lot, and of course, Kim's having a conference with a student, and there is Bob in the car, just Bob Wrigley, her husband, in the car, just sitting there, like completely resigned to his fate of waiting while Kim Barnes has a conference with a student. So we're in for a treat, and let's welcome Kim Barnes.
Thank you, Julie. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Oh, good. I set this up as a Q&A because I feel like in the craft talks and sessions, I really like my presentations not to be hermetically sealed, and ones that I've presented at various conferences, you know, around the country. And so what I'll be asking you to do is to help me along, ask me your questions, but what I will respond with will not be 2 sentences, just so you know. So you will, what this often turns into is a kind of little mini lectures. And from my experience and my teaching and my interaction with editors, agents, you know, publishers. So, and I welcome your questions about any aspect of the writing life. And my students will hear me repeat myself repeatedly over these 10 days. But I was talking to them yesterday about there is the writing of the material, the art of writing, and then there is the business of writing. And both of them will be part of your life, but never confuse the two, because they are not the same thing. So I want to just go ahead and start with an anecdote from my own life. When I was a young mother, had 3 young children, and I had been writing poetry and had then published some poetry early on, and had written some short stories and had published those short stories early on. They all had the title that went something like In the Wilderness, which is the title of my first nonfiction book. And what I discovered is that I had this story that I call my master narrative. Each of you has a master narrative. Part of the struggle of becoming a writer of nonfiction is to discover what that master narrative is. And that's one thing I hope to help my students do. I understood that my master narrative was about growing up in the logging camps in north central Idaho, about my father, who was a very dominant person in my life, and about my church that I had been deeply involved in. I was a child faith healer. I spoke in tongues. And my journey through that and out of it, and to a point of some kind of resolution in my spiritual life. And whether I called it poetry, fiction, or nonfiction, it was like a black hole. It sucked everything in, no matter what I tried to write about. If I tried to write about seahorses, it became about my master narrative. And I've discovered that this is so often the truth when writers are writing, that no matter what they write about, it somehow begins to revolve around their master narrative, whatever that master narrative is. So I had been writing all these things. I became friends with Mary Clearman Blue. We were teaching together. She's a wonderful writer, both fiction and nonfiction. And she's my mother's age and became a kind of mentor to me. But I asked her if there were any books out there of Western women writers, contemporary Western women writers, and there weren't. And I said, you know, we should edit one. And she said, let's do it. This is what mentors do, by the way. Let's do it. And she meant it. The next day we had a contract with Penguin. And because it was time. But what happened is Mary Clearman Blue and I began to look for women writers and pull these writers together, is that it required that she and I meet at the bar once a week for several hours, and to drink, because Mary Clearman Blue is from a ranch in Montana, to drink whiskey ditches. In fact, they were Jack Daniel ditches, which is just a Western way of saying whiskey and water. And they're called whiskey ditches. And we'd spend maybe the first 10 minutes talking about the anthology. And then we'd spend the next 2 hours talking about life stories. And during that time, that's so good. Thank you, Lucinda. Yes, that's it. What do you do when you have brought the wrong material to your craft lecture? You send your lovely assistant, Lucinda, to run it off. And she did. Thank you. But what I discovered talking to Mary Clearman Blue was how my own narrative was like any other narrative in fiction, how my story could be shaped into an arc, into a plot arc. And I was out, we lived out in the middle of nowhere on the Clearwater River on Highway 12 in Idaho. I mean, I know Idaho's in the middle of nowhere, but this was in the middle of nowhere. And nothing for miles on either side except rattlesnakes. And I was out digging on the garden in the canyon wall. We were trying to make a garden. So when I tried to water the zucchini plant, and it was 120 degrees, and it hissed, I thought that was how hot it was. And then later I realized, oh, that was a rattlesnake. It was that kind of place. But I was out spading up what might be a garden. And it dawned on me as I was standing there looking out all over the Clearwater River, which is the water of my birth. I grew up on the feeding streams of the Clearwater River because my father was a logger. And water was essential. They used to push the logs into the water during spring runoff, and then you'd have a log drive. The men would literally herd these logs down to the mills downriver on the water. And it dawned on me that that soil I was turning over was like memory. Layer by layer by layer. And that the river had cut its way down from the top all the way down into the cleft of that canyon. And that somewhere in that river, on the banks of that river, with the arrowheads left by the Nespers and the mussel shells, that of the mussels, the freshwater mussels, may be a barrette from my hair that I had lost as a child when I was playing in the creeks, or cricks, as we call it, beside the logging camps, 90 miles away. And it's the only epiphany of my life, by the way. I dropped the shovel, the spade, and ran in the house and started writing what would become my first book, In the Wilderness, which would become a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And I've never forgotten that moment. I think if I could have taken enough Adderall, I could have written it in like a week. It was all just there for me. It was like that fast. I saw the mythology of my childhood story. I saw the beginning, the middle, and the end of my childhood story. I had the opportunity to go and finish a terminal degree in Montana after I already had a contract for the book, which did not endear me to my workshop mates. But I had the great opportunity to study with the great writer and teacher, William Kittredge, and who's always been old and cranky. You know, he was old and cranky when he was 10. And I had finished In the Wilderness, had sent it off to my publisher, so it was in the can, if you will. And I thought, boy, I'm glad that's over. That was hard, writing that about my life. Now I'm going to write a novel, because I'm tired of nonfiction. I'm tired of doing what Terry Tempest Williams called writing at the level of the bone, because it hurts. And when I talked to her after she wrote Refuge, she said, Kim, it took me a year to recover from writing that book. It was like, she said, someone had peeled back all the layers of her skin and muscle, and she was just exposed at the level of the bone. And I felt that too. So I went into the workshop, the fiction workshop, and I've told some of my students this, to Bill Kittredge. And you have to understand, Bill Kittredge is like an enlightened redneck. He grew up on his family owned the largest cattle ranch in Oregon. And he grew up on horseback in the middle of nowhere. And he went to Iowa, he got his college degrees, he started writing. He remains a cowboy. He acts like a cowboy. And he would go, so you're in this MFA program that you've competed with people from all over the world to get into, right? And you're wanting one-on-one time with Bill Kittredge. Well, you discover Bill Kittredge will let anyone in his graduate level workshop. Anyone. We'd have 35 people in a graduate level workshop, many of them people he had met at the bar. And he'd say, oh, hell, come on, you got a story to tell. You need to come on in this workshop. So here's all these Ivy League, people like Andrew Sean Greer and John Lennon, these people who will eventually become very well-known literary writers. And we're sitting there with Meg from down at the tavern. And she looks the same in the classroom as she looked when he met her at the bar. But he would say maybe one sentence to everyone. And it was the one sentence that would change the book or change the story. But I thought, okay, I'm going to write a novel now. I'm going to hell with this confessional stuff. It's time to write some fiction and really distance myself. So I wrote the first chapter of what would be a novel that begins, the yellow Corvette Stingray pulled up to the drive-through window. The young girl looked through her pane of bulletproof glass at the man behind the wheel. He wasn't handsome, but interesting. Wild blue eyes, wild dark hair, tall and thin, and I knew right away there was something different about him. And it goes from there. And it's a cautionary tale, an adventure story about this girl who falls into this relationship with this man that will eventually become abusive. She doesn't know it at the time, but he's what we would call now a sexual predator. And he goes about a very methodical seduction that involves a lot of red roses and a lot of lobster, which the girl's never tasted before. And the story won't go well for a long time. And in fact, I see it as a kind of looking for Mr. Goodbar where it really won't go well by the end for the young woman. And I brought that in, and everybody had read it in the class, and he asked for a response, and everybody just sat there for a long time. And someone said, I don't think I'd have her spewing pink vomit after she drinks all the daiquiris. And I wrote my note down, no pink vomit. It was a great workshop response, right? Then everybody just got real quiet. It was a good chapter. And Kittredge looks at me and he says, this is really well done, Kim. And he said, I think you could send this in as a proposal, novel proposal right now and sell it. I think you'd get a good advance on this. And I was like, and of course all the other students are. And then he looked at me in front of, Meg, the bar wench, and Andrew Sean Greer, who will go on to write this amazing book that John Updike will praise in the New Yorker. And Kittredge said, the question is, why would you write it as fiction? And he outed me in front of everybody. And I was so mad at him. I was so mad at him because I thought I could keep that girl under wraps. I had her in the closet. That girl who gets into this relationship with this man and lets herself be seduced by a predator and loses every aspect of her independence, loses her car, loses her guns, loses her job, loses her family, and is finally so isolated and alone that she's a prisoner because he won't let her leave the house. Until she rises up and dares him to do what he has threatened to do. He's a two-tour veteran of Vietnam with a really bad coke habit. And she goes and finds him and brings it on. And he violently rapes her and leaves her and tells her that he'll be back before she's dead. When she thinks she has forgotten and she is no longer afraid, he will come back and he will find her again. And that's a story I didn't want to write, because if I wrote it as nonfiction, as Carol Houck-Smith, the great editor, said to me, Kim, you have to become that girl again. You have to lie down with that girl. And I did. And that became my second memoir, Hungry for the World, that I did not want to write. And it about killed me to write it. But I think I'm telling you this anecdote because it defined my life in many ways. But it also addresses the question, when do you know how to write it as a novel? And when do you know how to write it as memoir? And why? How and why? Did I know? I went home and I was really in despair. He can't tell me what to do. I can write it as a freaking novel if I want it as a novel. You know what I mean? But he called me on it. Because what Kittredge has always understood is that there's a reason to write it as nonfiction. And it's not just because you want to. It's about your responsibility to the story that is part of who you are. It is about your responsibility of having survived that journey. Going through the aspects of the journey. Often, as Joseph Campbell knew, what that means is that you have to go to a very dark place. and you have to survive, and you have to come out through the portal on the other side. But that's not the end of the journey. What's the end of the journey, of the hero's journey? You have to come back with the boon. You have to come back to the tribe bearing the boon, which will enlighten and allow your tribe to move forward with new knowledge. And that's something I believe in very much. And I write first and foremost to serve the art, no matter what I'm writing. But the second reason I write, which is why we do art anyway, of any kind, is that by bearing witness to my journey, I bear witness to the lives of others. Even though it's my story, it's not about me. It's not about me. Kittredge said, Kim, when readers read your memoir, they should come away knowing more about themselves than they do about you. And that's exactly how fiction works. You come away knowing more about yourself than you do about the character you've just read. I'm going to stop there now and open it up to questions. And like I said, you can ask questions about anything, about the market, about the act of writing, about truth with a capital T. I'll even answer that. So, any questions? Julie?
So you talked about the novel as distance, and that was the impulse to say, well, this will be a novel, it's distance. But then you did write a novel, and was it distance, or what was its lure? Why did that story have to be a novel?
Right.
Sort of looking at it now
Right.
from the other side.
So this is my third novel.
Yeah.
And what I've just,
The first one.
yeah, the first one. I had stories that I wanted to tell that interested me at the level of creating of character. And the first two came out of certain family mythologies. But those mythologies, the thing about those mythologies is that they are part of my master narrative, even though they're fiction. So what I ask my students to do, whether it's in fiction or nonfiction, is to observe the story you want to tell as a component of a much larger story. So I'm very Jungian, okay, as in Carl Jung. And I believe that there are only so many stories. And you can go ahead and try to prove me wrong. And, you know, Carl and I will work with you on that. But you know what they are. You know, they're the hero's journey. There's stories of tragedy. There's girl meets boy. There's the stranger comes to town, whether it's a virus or a gunslinger. Things were this way, this came into town, and now things are that way. It's very basic. Doesn't mean there may be spaceships, there may be cowboys, or both. And so what I have come to be able to observe, and I think this is essential, you think about Faulkner, you think about Hemingway, you think about Toni Morrison. They're writing different books all the time, but they are still mining the same vein. Toni Morrison's mythology has not changed. Her self-created mythos has not changed. She's just going deeper and deeper and deeper. Same with Faulkner, same with Hemingway. So as I look at my mythos, okay, what I understand are a couple of things. I am very oriented toward tragedy, and I mean Greek. I like a lot of bodies on the stage. And it's one thing I deal with in my novels is my agent will call and she said, Kim, do they all have to die? Can't someone stay alive? I'm like, it's a tragedy, Sally. I don't care. You know, we need to keep some people on board. Yeah, some readers on board. But I understand that sense, because if you go through the tragic sequence, what you understand is that you have a hero who's noble. Now, that can be Oedipus, or that can be Randall Patrick McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who's an anti-tragic hero. But don't forget hero. That's the word. By the way, Aristotle said that women can't be tragic heroes because they are not possessed of enough nobility to fall. I've been working on that. But a noble man or woman who has great leadership ability and insight, but is equally flawed and is blind to that flaw. And through that blindness brings chaos down on the people he loves the most and destroys his community because he has dared seek his own destiny and enact his own free agency and gone against his fate. Remember Oedipus? You will kill your father and sleep with your mother. Oh, no, I won't. Pretty soon he's wandering the streets of Thebes with his eyes blinded by his mother's pin. And I'm fascinated by that story. I'm fascinated by the idea of Lucifer's story, descent, and his from the angel of light, and how chaos will reign until he comes to his penance. This is part of my upbringing. It's also my father's life as I have known it. My father was an incredibly noble man. He was a man of enormous conviction, and he was so wrong. He was so wrong. I work through that in my nonfiction, but it's also part of my fiction. I take like these characters who they are trying to escape their fate and their destiny. And it can be Shane. Do you guys remember Shane? Sure. Shane, come back, Shane. I've always been fascinated by that story because it's a story of someone, of an anachronism. The gunslinger, Shane, who comes in, he's trying to lay down his guns. We're on the cusp of farmland being taken over by the ranchers. This always happens at the cusp of change, which is where all my stories, no matter what, are set. I'm fascinated by the cusp of change because anything can happen on the cusp of change. And by the way, the Southern grotesque comes directly out of the cusp of change because that's when the worlds get mixed up. Old South, New South, that's where Flannery O'Connor sets all her stories, is all, in all that changing. But we know Shane comes in, he's a gunslinger, he's put down his guns. Guess what? He's fated to be a gunslinger. He puts down his guns, he's going against his fate. What happens? All hell breaks loose. Until finally, in order to restore order, he has to put on his guns and do what he has to do. And then he has to self-exile. He's what's called a sin eater. Have you ever heard that term? He's what's called a sin eater. You have to take on the chaos, put it inside of you, and then move out of town and take it with you. So when I wrote my first novel, which is called Finding Caruso, its first title was Goodnight Irene. Remember that song? Everybody recorded it. From the Grateful Dead, all way on back. And Irene was my main character because what I had asked myself, okay, it's Idaho, it's the 60s. I'm interested in the 60s because we're on the cusp of enormous change, because it's part of my life and my parents' life. Who's my Shane? Who's my Shane? And I thought, Irene is my Shane. Irene. She doesn't ride in on black horse. She rides in a black Lincoln Continental. Where are her guns? What does a woman have? Bob Martin?
Yeah, I know you were.
I just want you to know there's 12 people in my class, and Bob is the sole male. And I've been watching his face with great interest. Bob, what does a woman have that is equivalent to a gunslinger's guns?
40 feet.
That's right. And maybe one will do, right? She has her sexuality, and that's all.
By the way, before the class, you've taught me all this.
That's right. But it's what she's trying to escape. That side of herself. That side of herself. And she finds that she brings chaos when what she's trying to escape is her own chaos. And that she must go back and embrace the very thing she's trying to escape. It's a retelling of shame. So all these elements, if you can identify in your lives what movies meant the very most to you, what novels meant the very most to you, there's a reason why you're responding. There's a reason. And often you will discover in those narratives your own master narrative and how you can write it in so many ways. So my view is very dark because I grew up in this church that said, as a daughter of Eve, you are dangerous, dangerous, dangerous. You brought down the world. You ruined everything and everybody. And so as the daughters of Eve, we had to be silent and submissive, and we had to be invisible. This was the whole idea. And this is not just part of my culture. As you know, this is worldwide in many ways and in many cultures. And so when I grew up, and I'd go against my father and I'd be punished. I'd run away from home, I'd get dragged back and whipped. I left home the night of high school graduation because my father said, you go, you never come back. And I did. Enacted my own agency, right? Got out from underneath my father, left the church, and as my mother said, out of the frying pan, into the fire. And that's how I end up with the Vietnam vet. That was my punishment. I believed that. I believed that. That you will either be punished or even killed. Thelma and Louise, right off the cliff. They're enacting their agency, but that's their only choice. And when I wrote In the Kingdom of Men, and I have a female narrator who's my protagonist who will not obey. She's in Saudi Arabia, and she will not obey. I know what's going to happen. All hell's going to break loose. It was all I could do not to kill her because of it. Because in my mind, that's what's going to happen. She will be subdued. She will, as my family, she will have a bit put in her mouth. You can be a high-spirited filly for a while. And then there comes a time when those women become alarming. I think it's changing. But in fiction and in nonfiction and in movies, tell me it's not the same. We're finally getting some noble heroes who are women, who are noble enough to have an equally tragic flaw that brings chaos on the community that they then have to set right. But they're in things like Kill Bill. As Andre Dubus said, you know his work? Not the third, but the father, Andre Dubus. Amazing writer. He has one of the best stories in my mind ever written called A Father's Story. And if you haven't read it, I hope that you will. And it's a story told by the father whose daughter has made a terrible mistake. And he covers for her and saves her from her punishment. And at the end, and he's a Catholic, a very dedicated, devoted Catholic man who goes to Mass and goes to confession every day. And at the end, he has a conversation with God, which is so risky, and it works. And God's saying to him, you should not have done that. You should have let her deal with the consequence of her actions. And the speaker says, it's my child, you know, my only child. And God says, well, I had an only child. And I sent him to die on the cross. And the speaker says, yes, but if he had been your daughter, you could not have borne her passion, meaning pain. And this is what defines our female characters in literature and film. We can let them be victims, but we cannot let them bring it on themselves because we cannot bear for our mothers, our daughters, our sisters to have to endure that pain of their mistakes. I'm trying to break this, and it's something I find easier to do in fiction than nonfiction, although it's still very hard for readers to accept. Does she have to be responsible for that? My agent asked. Yeah. Yeah, she does. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was really struck by what the editor said about you have to become that girl again and lay down with her. How did you find compassion for her who brought it on herself? And how about a measure of compassion for the Vietnam vet?
Right. And so I'm going to kind of answer that question, you know, inverted a little. When you write nonfiction, and this is my perspective, this is what I believe, you have to treat your characters in nonfiction with the same kind of compassion and generosity and complexity that you do your characters in fiction. There are no villains. There's people we make villains, there's monsters we create, and we can start listing them off. But as we know, you go back into that villain's life, there's some complex character development going on. And so in nonfiction, I think it's essential that you ask of every one of your people on the stage, characters by any other name, who are they and why? So the Vietnam vet, number one, there's a reason why I fell for him. Smart, he read books. That's always, I'm a sucker. Forget the lobster and roses, you know, he reads books. He was a long-haul truck driver. My dad was a truck driver. He was a woodsman, excellent marksman, of course, and woodsman. And my dad was the same. It's like psychology textbook 101. But before I could convince my readers that it was, they could see how I could get in this relationship. I had to show them how that happened. I had to make them fall in love with David James a little. You know what I mean? And then as I discover his complexity, and he tells me about he shows me his medals from Vietnam. He was a gunner on a Huey and he was a hero. Jumped out and rescued a number of soldiers off the ground. And I had to understand his story and what brought him to that. If you can't do that with your father, ooh, I turned for the chalkboard. You have to have an antagonist to have a story. If you don't have an antagonist, you have no story. There's no tension. Now, that antagonist can be, my students always say, well, I'm my own antagonist. I'm like, oh, please. Yes, everybody's his own antagonist, right? There's no story there. There's no story there. I need an antagonist. It can be a father. It can be a mother. It can be a town. It can be a community. Where's the tension? What do you desire and what gets in the way of what you desire? That's your antagonistic element. The other side of that is I've been asking my students, what do you fear? And what will happen if that fear is realized? What is your greatest fear? If you can figure that out, you're on your way to understanding your master narrative because it's all tied together. It's all tied together. It's all a melody. It's all in harmony. So when Carol Houck-Smith said that to me, now here's the thing, I had 30 beautiful pages of writing. It was so good. I was a poet, you know? And I had sent it to my agent. She loved it. She sent it to Carol Houck-Smith, who's this famous editor who has mentored and nurtured so many writers. And she's about this tall, little Jewish woman, lifelong New Yorker. And my agent sent it to her. You know, it was very spatial, very beautiful, very lyrical, 30 pages, had, you know, evoked this atmosphere, gave parts of the story, and she called from New York. This is still in the days, you know, no cell phones, but she called from New York, and you never knew who was on the line then. And she said, Kim? And I said, yes. She said, this is Carol Houck-Smith. And I said, hi, Carol. She said, what is all this poetic bullshit? First words out of her mouth. And I was slain, you know? And she talked to me for an hour, and finally she said, Kim, you have got to start at the beginning and go to the end. This is not a poem. It's not a poem. You got to tell a story. We got to have rising action. We have to have conflict. We have to have false resolution. We have to have a turning point. We have to have resolution and falling action. And I said, but no, nonfiction stories never resolved. I'm still living it. And she said, oh, honey. She said, I loved her. She said, I'm not talking about resolution in your life. She said, I'm talking about resolution at the level of craft. It has to have resolution at the level of craft. So I only cry when I get mad. You know, I mean, crying, you weren't to cry. Every now and then a little, tear come up, but we were whipped for crying, and you learn. I was so mad I had tears in my eyes. Ooh. And Bob and I went to bed, turned out the lights, he went to sleep, and I'm lying there just fuming. 2 o'clock in the morning, I got up, turned on the lights, got the scissors and tape, and cut that all to pieces into sections. I lined them out chronologically. It looked like I had basically an outline of my entire story. I taped them back together in chronology, and then got up the next morning and started filling in the white space with scene. And I hardly did any revision after that on that book. That's the first one. Now the second one, when she read it, by the way, she didn't buy either one of these books, she only mentored me on them, which she's known for doing, or was known for doing. When she told me that I had to lie down with that girl, I cried out of anger again. And I have never been laid so low by attempting to write something. I had closeted her. Now, here's the thing. I thought I'd told Bob everything. I hadn't. It's all in my head. I've never let it outside my head. I told him I had a relationship with an abusive man, blah, blah, blah. I was lucky to escape with my life, blah, blah, blah. Went back to college, everything like that. So as I start writing this, I have to remember it. I was 19 years old and I'd been separated from the world by my father and the church. I wasn't even allowed to go to ball games. Forget dances and movies. I had no idea. Completely armorless. And so as I sat down to really let myself go back and be that girl again, the strangest thing happens, and some of you who've been through this know it. All the emotions that you should have been feeling then and didn't because you're numb and stupid and innocent and ignorant and only think you know what you're doing, as my father used to tell me, they come flooding back on you. And the fear that I didn't feel then, holy cow, it just laid me out on the floor. And we can say this is psychology, I know that. But it's also true. This is what Joseph Campbell talked about. Let me bring my scarf back here. I became catatonic. I mean, literally sitting in my chair, catatonic. Like lobotomy. And I was going through that dark place that Campbell says you have to go to in order to move forward, that portal. You have to be reborn. You have to rebirth into your other life. And boy, I see it in my writers who are trying to write narratives of trauma. I get them set up. They have to get a support network set up. And they have to understand what's ahead, because you will get sick. You will get sick. And you have to turn and face fire. You have to look at it and not turn away. And it took me so long. I'd say, I don't want to write this. I don't, and it wasn't like my mom saying, Kim, you don't write that. Because I'm strangely I'm an anarchist. It's like I will do what I want to do, which is why I'm punished all the time. But it was me. I was talking to that girl. Man, don't you come in here. Don't you come in here. I've got a husband. I've got little kids. I've got, a life. I'm a professor. Do not bring your chaos and your stink in this room with me. I'm done with you. And, of course, I had to. And as all that started coming back on me, number one, I got a little crazy. And I had to talk to Bob about it because I was going crazy. He got angry, not at me, but at the man. He wanted to go hunting down David James and kill him, right? And that was hard. I didn't want his anger. It was really hard on the whole family. So I'm going to read you a paragraph. What happened when I came to spots I couldn't bear. And by the way, poetry was great here. I would go write a poem. See that girl? See that girl right there? See what's happening to her? Not me. That's a girl in the poem, right? And it would allow me to bridge, because poetry is actually the most intimate genre. It's the most intimate. It's not the most confessional in that sense, but the most intimate. So I would write poetry that would help me get a long ways, because really what I was dealing with was shame. I let this happen to me. I let this happen to me. And so I got to the point where I'm trying to break away from David, as I call him, and I know what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen. He had told me he had raped other women before. By the way, his goal was to prostitute me. He would take me to the lap dancers in Seattle so they could teach me, and he wanted to be my, I don't know, pimp or whatever. It had more to do with power than anything. I thought I knew the dangers of opposing David. I believed I could bear the consequences. When he threatened me at the bar, I'd felt even stronger, more determined. I knew that this is what I must do. I called his mother, said that he should come and get what was his. The next day I watched as he carried the boxes and bags to his pickup. I didn't flinch, didn't offer a word of apology or regret. He came out of the bedroom with my shotgun, said he'd take it for what money I owed him, the rent, the food. He left me with less than he'd found me with, and that seemed right. Why then, having made such a clean break, now here's the thing. I love nonfiction because you can talk to yourself on the page. I'm like, what in the hell was I thinking? That's me now talking to that girl. What? Why did you call him back? Are you insane? Are you insane? And I have to answer the question. I did it. I don't know why I did it. That's why I'm writing this. And I call on my other narratives of my father and how he brought me up, of what I know to be true about growing up in the woods and about tracking and predators. All this stuff I know, what you know, comes in to shape the story, because you have to shape the story. There has to be movement. There has to be echoing images. So this story of my father taking me and my brother out when I'm in my 20s and getting us lost in the woods intentionally. I mean in the woods, folks. I mean deep woods. I mean Idaho wilderness. Getting us lost there and then refusing to lead us out. You got to make your own map, he said. Follow it. And he just sat there, getting dark, no food. We can't find our way out. It's a lesson. Everything with my father was a lesson. And I use that as a metaphor. I'm lost here. I'm lost in this wilderness of self. I can't find my way out. I can't find my way out. All I know to do is what he taught me to do. Because when I stood up to my father and survived, terrified of him, I was shaking in my boots when I left the night of high school graduation. And he came to find me where I was, but he couldn't find me because it would have been real trouble if he had found me. I bring all that here onto this. Why then, having made such a clean break, did I call him the next week, agree that he could come over for dinner? I know I was crazy with loneliness, but that is not enough to explain the risk I was taking. I can almost believe that I knew what it was, why it was I who must initiate some final scene, because he was not finished with me. I wanted control, owning what I could of time and place. If I called him to me, he could not take me by surprise. Or was there part of him, part of who I was with him, that I could not let go of? something more simple than dependence, something less than love, a last fix of the intoxicating rush of the forbidden he had introduced me to, a goodbye kiss to my bittersweet shadow. Now, I'm talking about mythology, and I'm talking about Carl Jung here again. Jung says we all have an other. We have a dark side. We are like the moon. And those of us who survive, he says, we project that dark side onto an other. So have you ever read Sula by Toni Morrison? Do you remember who the main character is? It's not Sula. It's Nell. The girl who wants to be white, who's pinching her nose all the time, trying to get rid of her darker self. And Sula embodies that other. She is the other. Well, what happens when you do this, Jung said, is that you project your dark side onto another. For you to move forward, that dark side, that dark other, often has to eat your sins and die with them and sacrifice so that you can move on. That other side that I was kind of projecting, allowing David James to be for me, there was part of it that was still so seductive, to live on that edge. So now I got to try to write the scene. And I don't want to write the scene. I don't want to write the scene. You got to write the scene, by the way. It's not like, a head-shy horse. Not going to look. Don't hit me. Not over here. You got to write the scene. You would write the scene in fiction. Are you kidding me? This is the whole thing we've been leading up to, and you're not going to go there? You can't do that. That's the heart. That's the whole point. This is where everything turns. It turns. I couldn't write it. I cannot cheat here. I don't mean to be coy. Who am I talking to? Talking to my reader, talking to me. I'm saying, you can't cheat here. This isn't where you go into, lyrical flights. This isn't where you get all abstract-y and say, oh, then something happened and I was never the same. This is where I have to go right at it. Let me play it like a movie then, because that's how it exists for me. A reel that can be run forward and back and wraps around on itself and begins and ends and begins again. Now I'm getting at something. Because when you write nonfiction, it's not about what happened. It's not about what happened. We know you're here writing the dang thing. You know what I mean? We know you survived because you're writing it. But you've got to create a tension and make your reader forget that you're here writing this. People will read this book and they'll say, I'm so worried about you. And I'm like, here I am. But it's in the why where the story exists. Memoir is about you wrestling with memory. And that's what I was doing, trying to write about this girl. I mean, it was like wrestling with the angels. I'm not kidding. I was on the floor wrestling with this memory, with this girl. But I couldn't just say it. So I used craft. I thought, I'm just going to put it in third person. Then it's not me. Yes. Right? So a man comes to the door, and the woman lets him in. They talk a few cool words, then she rises to make dinner. They sit together on a worn green sofa, plates of deer meat and potatoes balanced on their knees. They watch TV. So, what are you hearing here as far as craft? What's happening to my sentence structure? Go ahead.
Well, you just switched to external person. So
right.
You're no longer the girl, you're the presence of the girl.
Right, right. I'm the omniscient narrator. I have complete control at this point. I'm also started writing in paratactic instead of hypotactic sentences. Now, what Hemingway wrote paratactically, he wrote what's called parataxis. And it just means that it was a good wine, it was a clean wine, it was a good and clean wine. That's parataxis, just the facts. Hypotaxis is Faulkner. And then, and he start, and semicolon after semicolon, and comma after comma, and my gosh, his sentences go on for pages. That's hypotaxis, okay? Now, I write hypotactically a lot because I'm lyrical, so I have all this lyrical writing going on. But when I turn to the scene, not only do I go into third person, I go into parataxis. Why? Every craft decision you make better be for a reason. Why do I go into parataxis? Go ahead.
To take the emotion away.
It takes the emotion away. And I also put it in present tense. So you guys ever watch like Dragnet? It was 5:05 in the city. It's just the facts, man. I'm doing hard-boiled crime detective novel stuff. We cannot hear the television or what few words pass between them. The woman drinks a single glass of the wine he has brought, but it goes to her head in a way she will remember later as odd, making her feel less drunk than pleasurably sleepy, a little giddy high, really. The world seems a good place. He draws her to the carpeted floor, undresses her, ties her wrists and ankles, gags her with a scarf. He takes pictures with a Polaroid he has brought in a bag. So what I'm doing at this point is just going over what I know for sure. I'm just doing my inventory. I've got food. I've got a camera. I've got these other things that are his tools and utensils, if you will. He hurts her then in ways he has not done before, and the pain and fear cut through the feeling she has had of floating, of being coddled. She quits fighting the ties that cross over her. She knows how they are made to tighten this way. She tries to scream, whether out of fear that a neighbor might hear or compassion she would never assume. He pauses, lifts her to the couch, unties her, takes the cloth from her mouth, but then he hurts her again. She cannot cry. She's tired. Now, this is what I remember feeling. Not fear, but this. I was so tired. He covers her with a blanket, wraps it behind her back. He's done with her now, she thinks. Now she can sleep. But then he lifts her and moves toward the door. Where are you taking me? She asks. There are others, he says, waiting. Others want to have her. He will take her to them. No. He hesitates in the doorway. There between the cold night and the warm room, she says it again. No, she says, I will scream. She says this without looking at him because she cannot open her eyes or raise her head because she is so tired. She cannot be afraid because there is no fear left in her. He stands in the doorway for a long time, it seems, holding her like a child, one arm beneath her shoulders, one arm beneath her knees. She rests, given over now to what must happen next. And when he turns and steps back into the room, she is not surprised, but indifferent. He lays her on the couch. He kneels down beside her, strokes her hair, and then he tells her, makes this promise. Just as he has done with other lovers, he will someday come back for her. Years from now, when she is nearly forgotten, when she is alone, and the world sleeps deftly on, he will find her. He leaves, closes the door behind him with a hush. She is asleep before the noise of his engine can reach her, and she does not hear him pull away. The woman who as a child could numb herself to the belt finds that she can once again shed her skin and slip away, untethered, untouched, dreaming of nothing, gone, 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 to the nothing song of air. So I move in that scene from that third person, disassociated, which is what I felt, into a point of lyrical consideration from this point of view, which brings that emotion up. Now, I thought I would change this to first person. I thought I'll write it in third person, and then I'll change it. And my editor said, leave it, Kim. He said, it creates a different kind of tension, and it's also a way for your readers to allow themselves to stay in the presence of this. So after I got this manuscript done, it's on deadline, sold it on proposal. Deadline passed, it was done. It's under the bed. Editor calls, Kim, where's the book? Under the bed. I'll get it to you. And editors actually from New York will threaten to come to Idaho and get a book, which I find really interesting. I'm like, you don't want to do that. I then tied it with twine, like an old-fashioned parcel, and put it in my trunk and held it captive for 2 more weeks. Drove around with it for 2 more weeks in my trunk, bound and gagged. And until I realized what I was doing, it terrified me to let go of this book. And when I did, and as I was finishing it up, I loaded my guns and I started sleeping with them. Bob was okay with this a little bit. And everything became a weapon. So I'd go into the kitchen in the morning and I'd touch like the fireplace tools. Weapon, weapon. Knives in the drawer, weapon. Because I felt like having written this, I was calling him back to me again. And I was going to kill him. If he touched my children, I was going to kill him. And my husband was a CO in Vietnam, conscientious objector. There was just an amazing amount of violence. I had invited the enemy back into my house. So it wasn't until later when a woman who wrote Next Time She'll Be Dead and Women Who Kill about abused woman syndrome, she said, Kim, he was just a bully. He's old and weak now. He won't come back. And I thought, all right. You know, but she said, you told him no. You said no. And that broke the spell. I thought that was really interesting. So, okay, thank you very much.
Wow, so we're gonna take a little break, and then Patty McCormick's gonna give a reading, and she tackles these dark subjects too. So it's like you know, the Greek tragedy morning that we're having here on what might be a Tuesday.
Purgation's good.
Purgation.
Catharsis.
and catharsis. It's all right here. Meg Wollitzer's going to be introducing Patty McCormick, and thanks again to Kim Barnes.